Okay, I think we can get started. So welcome, St. John School, your first presentation. You're welcome to begin when you're ready. Before you do, please introduce yourselves and just give us your names and what year you all are, and then you have 15 minutes.
Okay, thank you. My name is Helen Yang.
I'm Jack Vu. I'm a senior.
I'm David Chin. I'm a junior.
Anik Banerjee. Okay. Anik Banerjee. I'm a junior.
And I'm Brandon Wu. I'm also a junior.
I'm a junior as well. And we're team 17524 from St. John School. As Texans, we're no strangers to the heat. In this year's M3 Challenge, we explored how extreme heat affects both individuals and infrastructure, from modeling how homes heat up without air conditioning, to forecasting long-term energy demand, and finally, to identifying which communities in Memphis are most vulnerable to these growing risks. To start off, in question 1, we were tasked with modeling the temperature inside 4 distinct homes experiencing a heat wave over a 24-hour period. Our first major assumption is that the house is modeled as an object with a uniform internal temperature. This assumption is essential for applying Newton's law of cooling, which relates the rate of heat transfer of an object to its temperature difference with the environment. Second, internal heat is assumed to come mainly from occupants and electronics. In typical residential settings, the main sources of internal heat are from occupants and electronics. Third, conduction through walls is assumed to be proportional to the surface area of the walls through which heat is exchanged. Fourth, additional heat transfer between indoors and outdoors occurs through ventilation, such as airflow through cracks. And finally, solar radiation is considered an external heat source that adds energy directly to the interior of a home, accounting for heat from sunlight entering through windows. In developing our model, we initially considered 2 approaches. 1, a physics-based differential equation model, or 2, a time series model. Our differential equation model is based on Newton's law of cooling, which relates an object's temperature change to its environment. Fundamentally, this closely mirrors how houses absorb or lose heat from their surroundings. On the other hand, a time series model predicts future indoor temperatures by identifying patterns in historical data, making it useful for capturing trends without directly accounting for physical factors. We concluded that a physics-based model is best suited for a problem statement because it, 1, doesn't require dwelling-specific historical data, which was not provided and would be nearly impossible to find, and 2, can be easily generalized to different house types due to having flexible parameters. The next step in building our model was considering each individual factor and their relationship to temperature change over time. The 4 factors we considered were conduction, radiation, ventilation, and internal heat generation. As you can see in our equation, both conduction and ventilation are proportional to the difference in internal and external temperature, consistent with Newton's law of cooling. The other 2 factors are related to direct energy inputs, where radiation is modeled as a term based on solar intensity and the absorption properties of the house, and internal heat generation is based on the assumed wattage produced by occupants and appliances. To solve the differential equation we derived, we outsourced data from the ASHRAE Engineering Handbook on coefficients associated with the 4 factors we mentioned, as they vary between different housing types. Next, to implement this model, we wrote a Python script that used Euler's method to numerically approximate the solution to the differential equation, giving us the final temperatures for the 4 dwellings over the 24-hour period.
Now for the results. We found that, regardless of factors like home insulation, size, and height, each of the 4 sample dwellings reached dangerously high temperatures, with peak temperatures all around 100 degrees. These findings imply that, regardless of a home situation, a lack of air conditioning yields potentially dangerous results for that home's inhabitants. For the sensitivity analysis, we perturbed each of the model's coefficients, as well as the home's initial temperature, by 10% in both directions from their original values. We then computed and plotted the total range of outcomes for these altered conditions. We found that the maximum and end temperatures for this entire range of possible curves varied less than 1 total degree, proving this model's strong resilience to changes in initial conditions. Some strengths of our model were that it captured the most significant physical factors in a home's temperature change, and that, as shown in the sensitivity analysis, the model proved resilient to changes in initial conditions. A weakness, though, is that it treats the model treats the home as a single homogeneous thermal zone, instead of considering internal temperature variation, for example, warmer, higher stories. The model may also struggle with extreme deviations due to weather changes like humidity, cloud cover, or excess wind.
On to section 2. Sorry. In part 2, we were tasked with developing a model for peak demand of power in Memphis and using it to make forecasts up to 20 years in the future. Our first step was to find relevant data on both temperature history and economic growth, and new data was collected and 7 new predictors were defined. Most importantly, we defined peak demand as the highest hour of consumption in megawatts each year. As you can see, we have a data table of that peak consumption here. For our model, we needed a few key assumptions, the most important of which is that historical trends remain relatively similar. This assumption allows us to generate plausible future values for our contributing features. The remaining assumptions are all important to making a robust and accurate regression model. Our next step was using the data to create a model. We discussed using a logistic regression, linear regression, and time series models as potential candidates for the problem. The nature of the problem did not suggest any justifiable reason for a carrying capacity, discouraging a logistic type model. While time series models can be effective for capturing seasonality, they require fairly serious, dense, and a regularly spaced historical data. Ultimately, we chose to use a more robust and interpretable model in a least squares linear regression. In our next step, we selected our model predictors through a process of backward selection, removing the most statistically insignificant components in each iteration of the model. This process narrowed our list of potential predictors from 7 to the following 3 possibilities: peak temperature, GDP, and dollars invested in the power grid. We found, though, according to our heat map of correlation, that GDP and dollars invested are highly correlated. And to avoid overcounting for similar phenomena, we removed the less predictive factor in dollars invested. As such, the final 2 predictors were peak temperature and GDP. Under the assumption that these 2 predictors change linearly for the next 20 years in line with historical data, we recorded 20 years of possible future values for these predictors. We then plugged these predicted values into the regression model to forecast that in 20 years, Memphis may need support for 3,357 megawatts of power at its peak in 1 hour. To confirm the validity of our model, we backtested the model on data from 2012 to 2022, and we analyzed our residuals. The mean squared percent error between the actual peak load and our model's predicted peak load in those years was just around 1.94%, indicating an accurate model. Our residual plot shows no discernible pattern and a constant spread, thus showing that the errors are fairly random, and this linear regression model captures the relationship well. Our regression model provides transparent methods and interpretable results and avoids collinearity. The low error and strong residual results also indicate a robust model. However, some weaknesses may be sensitivity to outliers and the assumption of linearity for a possibly nonlinear solution, or possibly nonlinear relationship.
For our next challenge, can you hear me? For our next challenge, we developed a vulnerability score to help the city of Memphis equitably allocate its resources during events of extreme heat. In designing a model to assign vulnerability scores, we made the following assumptions. Firstly, all Memphians behave rationally. During heat waves, they will act to protect their health and well-being. Second, min-max normalization is valid for the given data. We dealt with various metrics with different units, and in order to combine them into a meaningful vulnerability score, they must be normalized, scaling from 0 to 1. We assumed that there would not be any significant outliers, and because min-max scaling is a linear transformation, it would preserve any existing skewing of the metrics. We also assumed that each factor, once scaled in the same manner, would affect our vulnerability score equally. Each factor represents a unique quality of the community within a given neighborhood, and assigning them equal weights ensures that no one factor would overshadow another. Finally, we assumed that zip code is representative of a neighborhood. These are well-defined administrative units that allow for meaningful comparisons across the city. We considered a variety of potential factors that affected vulnerability, but as shown in our heat map, many of these factors were correlated with one another. For example, population and the number of households. So we made sure to avoid collinearity between the factors used. Eventually, 4 factors were chosen as representative of the vulnerability of a community. These are we had an animation here, but these are economic standing, which determines a community's access to air conditioning, green spaces, and healthcare. We also considered that a neighborhood with a higher population would have more people at risk, and these people will put more strain on the power grid. Furthermore, we considered that the elderly tend to spend more time at home, which further strains the power grid, and they may have underlying health conditions that are worsened by extreme heat conditions. And finally, we considered mode share. So people who get to work by walking or public transit will have their commute more drastically affected by heat waves due to the limited availability of shade and water. So for our model, we chose to use a direct sum, normalizing each of our 4 chosen factors, and then combining them into one total score. In the absence of any ground truth outcomes, which provide a reference for measured impact, this index instead reflects a synthesis of the key risk factors.
Here are the results of our scoring. When we look at the bar graph of vulnerability scores by zip code, we can see a wide spread. Some communities are relatively resilient, while others are far more vulnerable to the impacts of extreme heat. Our results can also be visualized on a map, which makes it more clear where the most vulnerable areas of Memphis are located geographically. The darker regions are those with a greater correlated vulnerability score. In South Memphis, which was the most vulnerable area according to our analysis, we see a rapidly growing population, yet a significant share of residents live below the poverty line. In the event of a heat wave, many of these residents would likely struggle to adequately respond. Downtown Memphis brings large numbers of people from diverse backgrounds together every day to support the city's economy. However, these busy areas would become serious points of vulnerability during heat waves, with crowds exposed to dangerous conditions. At the medical center, this vulnerability is similarly severe. A high concentration of individuals that require specialized medical care makes this area particularly susceptible to the impacts caused by power outages and heat waves, outages which could prove to be life-threatening. Our model compiled well-justified features with realistic implications of vulnerability, resulting in an interpretable and reasonable model. Furthermore, our chosen factors were found to be independent and correlated, meaning that direct summation within our model was both meaningful and interpretable. However, it is important to note that the model is built off of factors that are not direct measurements of heatwave consequences. Rather, we selected factors that we believed would influence the consequences of heat waves. This unsupervised model could benefit from real, consequence-based data to ensure reliability. However, this data would prove to be difficult to obtain in real life due to many restrictions on data surrounding health outcomes. HIPAA is an example of this. With these findings in mind, our group recommends that the City of Memphis implement a Cool Neighborhoods initiative to alleviate the impacts that heat has on Memphis communities. This program would target vulnerable communities, upgrading their streets and sidewalks with reflective, heat-reducing pavement and increasing shade with trees and bus shelters. These improvements would lower street-level temperatures, make walking and waiting for infrequent buses more comfortable, and lessen reliance on air conditioning, especially for seniors. So as we showed in part 1, the loss of air conditioning due to power outages forces people to endure life-threatening temperatures inside their own homes. At the same time, peak energy demand across Memphis will only continue to rise in the coming years. placing further strain on existing infrastructure. Yet these impacts are not felt equally. Vulnerable communities, like those you've identified, bear the brunt of the consequences, facing greater health risks and economic challenges. That's why we are proud to propose our policy solution to the city of Memphis: targeted infrastructure improvements that offer a meaningful path forward to protect its most vulnerable citizens. Thank you for your attention. We now stand open to questions.
Thanks for the presentation. I can start with a question. So I'm curious about the part 2 model. You do this linear regression, and I wanted to better understand what the data looked like that you fed into that model. So you mentioned something like investment into the power grid. What data did you use? Where did you collect it? And maybe like tell me a little bit about it.
Yeah, sorry. So we got most of our data from MLGW, like the Memphis, I think, power supplier. And we had a lot of different factors that we considered. I think I said 7. And our final few were GDP and peak temperature. However, other ones that we did consider and had found data for were dollars invested into the power grid, and even things like number of EVs used, and just a lot of different economic and temperature temperature data that we had found online through
So
them.
it's like by a year or something, or how do they produce
Yeah,
this?
all by a year.
And then how far back did you have it for?
Yeah, I think most of our data went back to 2007, although we only used from 2012 to 2022 in our model because that was like the data that we had for every single factor.
Okay, thanks. It's like it's a cool model that it uses so many features. It's a relatively brief time span, right? 2012 to 2002.
Yeah.
So do you think that impacted maybe the results of the model at all, or how could we, given more time, how could we account for that?
I think. Do you have something to say?
Sure. Yeah, and I think that is one of the big challenges to this competition, right? Finding enough data to use reliably, and I think that's why we decided on a linear regression, because of its robust nature and just very high amount of interpretability. So in light of limited data like we experience here, I think that modeling after linear regression is a really safe option, and that's why we're really proud of our part 2 model.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
All right. Can you hear me? Okay. Am I? All right, good. First, I do want to compliment your choice, in question 2, between multivariate regression and time series. That was interesting. My question is, though, about question 1. So in your sensitivity analysis, you varied starting coefficients. What are those starting coefficients?
Sure. So we had various conducting coefficients for different insulation types. And so, we pulled those coefficients from a handbook. And they're, we were fairly sure that they're reliable, but, insulation deteriorates, things happen. And so we were like, okay, if we change this coefficient as well as like our solar radiation coefficient, for example, which measured, right, how much heating there was due to the sun, as well as the ventilation coefficient. So like, how much do the windows, the cracks in the doors contribute? We had one more coefficient. What was it? It was the like the energy emitted from humans, right? Those were our 4 coefficients. So we changed those in either direction to see how these small changes in factors that aren't quite concrete would change the outcome. If that makes sense.
Thank you. Another question, why there was more variation in your results for smaller time than for the final time when you did sensitivity analysis?
I think just based on the trajectory, the conductivity sort of dominated the change in temperature throughout the day. And so as a result of that, the other 3 factors kind of became less relevant over the course of the day. And then you can see, if we pull up the slide, the trajectory kind of converges on just regression towards the outdoor temperature. And so that's why I think the difference gets smaller over time.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I had a question about question 1 as well. You set up your differential equation, and then you said you used a Python script with Euler's method. Could you comment on how you chose your time step and how much faith we can put in that, or how you test how robust that is?
Right, so I think we just, obviously there's some form of error associated with Euler's method and numerical approximations to solutions like this. But we chose a sufficiently small time step. I think it was, what was our time step? In the order of like a few seconds. So we just worked with the assumption that sufficiently small time steps would yield a solution that's fairly similar, which is, I think, fairly plausible for this situation. Thank you.
Okay, we have to wrap there, but thank you so much for the presentation. If you wanna, if your representative wants to get up and say, acknowledge anyone, this would be the time to do it, and then we'll transition to the next team. Thanks, guys.
So there are a number of people that our team would like to thank for this wonderful opportunity. First off, we want to thank our coach, Dr. Ralston. He couldn't make it here today to watch us, but I hope he's watching from home. I also really appreciated our chaperones, Mr. Gao and Ms. Fogler. They were both, them and the coach worked with us throughout the entire last few months to prepare, and they've helped us so much with the whole presentation and make sure we can make it as great as possible. And I would also like to thank the parents as well for supporting all of us throughout the entire process, particularly David's parents, who gave us a place to practice and host our meetings. And I would also like to thank our school, St. John's. I think that they prepared us excellently to tackle this problem and learn the math that we needed. And finally, I want to thank MathWorks and the M3 Challenge, because they provide our team with such an unforgettable experience and really allowing us to put our math skills to the test. We can't wait to participate in this challenge next year. Thank you.